Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the worn wooden floorboards of Colonial America, where you're about to discover that the good old days were actually kind of a slog. Picture this thing, it's 4G47 in the morning, and you jolt awake, not because of an alarm, but because your body clock knows the sun's about to crack the horizon and there's a mountain of work waiting. You're freezing. Your breath clouds in front of your face. The candle stub on your nightstand has burned so low it's basically a memory. Around you, at least 3 other people are crammed into this room, snoring and shifting in the darkness. Welcome to daily life in a colonial American home, where privacy is a luxury reserved for the dead and comfort is whatever you can convince yourself to accept. You probably won't survive a single day living like this. Over the next few hours, we're going to walk through what ordinary colonists actually experienced. Not the sanitized textbook version, but the gritty, sensory reality of existence between roughly 1607 and 1776. We're talking about the food you'd choke down, the clothes you'd never get clean enough, the diseases that killed more people than any war, and the profound boredom punctuated by sudden terror that defined most days. This isn't a lesson about the founding fathers or famous battles. This is about you, a colonial person with dirt under your fingernails and a persistent cough that might be consumption. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from somewhere interesting, drop your location and local time in the comments. I'd love to know where you're settling in for this journey. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You open your eyes fully, and the household begins to stir. Someone, probably your mother or eldest sister, is already downstairs raking embers in the hearth, coaxing yesterday's fire back to life, because starting a new flame from scratch takes flint, steel, patience, and more skill than you'd think. The first mainstream historical fact you're going to learn tonight is these colonial Americans typically woke between 4G30 and 5G100 in the morning and worked until dusk outside, which meant summer days could stretch to 18 hours of labor. That's not mythology. That's just how circadian rhythms and agricultural necessity aligned. But here's the quirky part that historians don't always emphasize. Some colonists actually kept their own sleep schedules in 2 chunks, a pattern called biphasic sleep. You'd sleep for 3 or 4 hours, wake briefly in the middle of the night, usually around midnight, and then sleep again until dawn. That middle waking was when you'd read, pray, think about life's problems, or, if you were feeling romantic, visit your spouse in a neighbor's house. Historians still argue whether this was genuinely common or just something mentioned in old diaries by particularly weird people. Your stomach is already growling. Breakfast, when it comes, won't be what you expect. Definitely not cereal or toast. You pad downstairs barefoot, shivering, and wait for someone to dish you a bowl of pottaging, a thick, lukewarm stew of whatever vegetables and grains were preserved from last season, maybe with a bit of salt fish if the household was doing well. The water you drink, because you'll drink water, not coffee yet, comes from the well and tastes faintly metallic and possibly brackish. You won't think about what else is in that well. You'll just drink it and hope you don't get sick. By the time the sun is actually up, you're already thinking about what you'll accomplish before sunset. And that, more than anything, is the rhythm that's about to swallow your day whole. The house you're living in right now, let's say it's somewhere in Massachusetts or Virginia, doesn't really matter which, is a small wooden structure that might have 2 rooms on the ground floor and a loft above where several of you sleep. The walls are made of rough, hewn timber, chinked with mud and straw. There's no insulation, so the mud mixture between the logs is basically doing the same job as a tissue held up to a hurricane. The roof leaks when it rains hard. The floorboards are uneven and splinter your feet if you're not careful. And it's February, which means the cold has settled in like an unwanted house guest who refuses to leave. You can see your breath inside the house, constantly, even near the main hearth, where your mother is currently feeding the fire more wood. Wood that you personally chopped and stacked last fall, assuming you weren't too exhausted. The warmth only extends about 4 feet. Beyond that radius, you're living in a walk-in freezer. The mainstream historical fact is this: colonial homes were designed primarily for shelter and storage, not comfort. Windows were small and made of oiled paper or, if the family was wealthy, actual glass panels. Either way, they let in almost no heat and barely any light. The goal was to keep weather out and heat in, and on both counts, the design was only semi-successful. Historians still argue about how cold these houses actually got in winter. Some estimates suggest indoor temperatures dropped to just above freezing at night, while others say it was marginally better. The point is, you're cold. Here's the quirky detail that makes this even worse. People used to sleep under piles of whatever textiles they could gather. Wool blankets, linen sheets, sometimes even straw-filled quilts. But those blankets and quilts absorbed moisture from your body and the general dampness of the house, so by winter's end, they were often damp and clammy rather than warm. You'd burrow under them anyway because the alternative was freezing, but you were basically sleeping under cold, wet fabric every single night. The hearth, that big fireplace in the main room, is theoretically the center of warmth and light, but it's also a source of constant problems. The chimney doesn't draw perfectly, so smoke backs up into the room. Your eyes water. Your clothes smell permanently of smoke. The fire needs feeding constantly, which means someone is always adding wood, tending it, watching for embers that might escape and catch the wooden walls on fire. And yes, fires did happen. Colonial homes burned down. It wasn't rare. And when a house caught fire, there was no fire department. Just neighbors with buckets passing water hand to hand from the nearest well or stream. You move through the house, and the cold guides you like an invisible hand. The chamber pot in the corner. Yes, there's a chamber pot, because you're not trudging outside in February at 3 a.m. To use a privy is icy to the touch. You use it anyway because you don't have a choice. This is daily life. This is normal. The kitchen area is slightly warmer because the hearth is larger there, but the cold still seeps in through every gap and crack. Your mother is preparing to cook something. Maybe a bread, maybe more pottage. The oven is built into the side of the hearth, heated by the same fire, and it's one of the only luxuries in the entire house. Not every colonial family had an oven. Some baked bread communally or paid a neighbor to use theirs. Your family is relatively lucky on this front. By midday, when the sun is highest, might warm up to something resembling tolerable. 50 degrees indoors, maybe. Used to calling this warm. Your standards have shifted catastrophically. When summer comes and the house is unbearably hot, stuffy, smoky, filled with insects, you'll remember these cold days and think about them almost fondly. For now, though, you're shivering. The cold has infiltrated everything: your clothes, your bones, your ability to think about anything except how to stay warm. And this is just February. You've got at least 6 more weeks of this ahead. Hide. By the time you stumble outside to begin your day, the cold has sharpened your focus into something almost painful. But before you can even think about the work ahead, you need to eat something more substantial than that bowl of pottage. The question that haunts every colonial household is the same one that haunted your family yesterday and will haunt you tomorrow. Where's the food going to come from? You're living in a society without grocery stores, refrigeration, or supply chains. Your survival depends entirely on what you and your family grew, hunted, trapped, or traded for during the warmer months. It's February, which means you're living off the preserved surplus of late autumn and early winter. Mainstream historical fact is straightforward: colonial food preservation relied on 5 primary methods: salting, smoking, drying, root cellaring, and fermentation. These techniques were literally the difference between eating and starving. Your family's root cellar, a dugout space beneath the house or in a hillside, lined with straw, still contains some apples, though they're wizened and soft. There are turnips and parsnips wrapped in straw, potatoes piled in corners, and cabbage that's been packed in salt and buried under layers of protection. There might be salted fish in a barrel, dried beans hanging in cloth sacks, leaves outside, and if your family was particularly successful last autumn, some smoked ham or bacon wrapped in cloth and hanging from the rafters. The quirky detail that most people don't realize is this: colonial families didn't eat a balanced diet. The way we think about it, they ate seasonally and opportunistically. Winter diets were monotonous. Lots of bread beans, preserved vegetables, and whatever protein they managed to salt down. Spring was often the hungriest season because the old stores were depleted and new crops hadn't grown yet. Some colonists actually lost weight in spring. Others got sick. A few starved. This is why early colonial settlements like Jamestown experienced what settlers called the starving time, periods when inadequate food preservation or failed harvests led to genuine famine. You grab a handful of dried cornbread from the shelf. It's hard as a stone and requires serious chewing, and maybe a cup of watered-down cider or small beer. Yes, small beer. Children and adults alike drank beer in colonial America because water was often unsafe. Small beer was a weak version, low in alcohol, basically brewed as a safer alternative to plain water. You grew up drinking it. Your kids will drink it. Nobody questions it. Breakfast consumed, you head out to feed the animals. The chickens need grain. The cow, if your family has one, needs hay and water. The pig, if you're lucky enough to have one, needs kitchen scraps and attention. Animals are infrastructure in colonial life, not pets. They represent wealth, future food, and transportation. You treat them with a mixture of necessity and mild indifference. Historians still argue about exactly how common livestock ownership was across different regions and social classes. Wealthy farmers had multiple cows, pigs, and chickens. Poor families might have just a few chickens or share a cow with neighbors. Some colonists had no animals at all and existed on a subsistence diet of grain, vegetables, and occasional hunted game. By mid-morning, if it's a day when you're preserving food, and there will be many such days, you might be salting fish or smoking meat. These are labor-intensive processes that can take weeks. You're essentially building your winter survival kit piece by piece, season by season. Every jar of preserved vegetables, every smoked ham, every barrel of salted fish is a small insurance policy against hunger. Miss a preservation window, fail to prepare adequately, and spring arrives while you're already eating spoiled stores or going hungry. The smell of a colonial kitchen in preservation season is overwhelming. Salty, smoky, pungent with fermentation and age. Your clothes absorb these smells. Your hair does too. By winter, you smell like preservation itself, like salt, smoke, fermented vegetables, and age. This is food reality in colonial America. Not feasts, not variety. Just the constant, grinding effort to keep enough calories in storage to make it from one harvest to the next. By mid-morning, you're back inside and someone, probably you, if you're old enough, is sitting at the spinning wheel. The wheel turns rhythmically, hypnotically, and your fingers are working raw fibers of wool or flax into thread. This is not a hobby. This is essential work. Every piece of clothing anyone in this household wears started as fiber and was transformed through your hands into thread, woven into fabric, then cut and stitched into garments. When those garments wear out, and they wear out constantly, they get mended, patched, and eventually cut into rags or stuffed into quilts. The mainstream historical fact is this: textile production consumed an enormous portion of colonial women's and girls' time. Historians estimate that women spent roughly 40 to 50% of their productive hours on textile work: spinning, weaving, sewing, mending, and washing. It was never ending because clothing wore out faster than you'd imagine, especially on people who were constantly working, sweating, and moving. Here's the quirky detail that makes this even more taxing: colonial textiles were expensive. A single piece of new cloth was a significant investment, so garments were worn until they literally fell apart, then repurposed. A worn-out shirt became patches for another shirt. When that was beyond repair, it became stuffing for a quilt or padding in a jacket. Eventually, when it was completely unusable, it might become cleaning rags. Almost nothing was truly discarded. Your clothing right now, assuming it's still winter, consists of a linen shift or shirt, the base layer, wool breeches or a wool skirt, wool stockings, and maybe a wool jacket or waistcoat over that. If you're a man, you might also have a hat. Everything is hand-dyed, hand-sewn, and constantly repaired. Dyes available were natural matter for reds, indigo for blues, weld or wood for yellows and greens. Colors were muted and earthy. Bright white was nearly impossible to achieve and stay that way, so most linen turn or cream with age and washing. Speaking of washing, you're not taking a hot shower. Bathing in colonial America was infrequent, often seasonal, and involved heating water over the hearth. A labor-intensive process that meant most people bathed maybe 2 or 3 times a year, usually in summer. You wash your hands and face regularly in cold water from the well. You wash your undergarments when you absolutely have to. Your outer clothes are brushed off, aired out, worn repeatedly. The smell is something you've accepted. Everyone smells this way. It's normal. Your stockings, if you can afford stockings, are hand-knitted wool, and they're being darned and re-darned constantly. The heel wears through. You patch it. The two follows. You patch that too. Some colonists became incredibly skilled at invisible mending because the alternative was going without, and going without in winter meant frostbite. Historians still argue about what average colonists actually looked like because clothing was so heavily influenced by social class. Wealthy colonists could afford more garments, finer fabrics, and better maintenance. Poor colonists made do with whatever they could afford or make themselves, often in earth tones and rough weaves. Children were dressed in smaller versions of adult clothes. No special children's clothing. You dressed like a tiny adult, and as soon as you could walk, you were expected to start contributing to textile work. By afternoon, your fingers are sore from the spinning wheel. The calluses have built up over years of this work, but during particularly intensive seasons, spring and fall, even those calluses crack and bleed. You keep spinning anyway. There's no choice. Somewhere in this house, someone needs a shirt or a pair of breeches or stockings or a patch for something that's torn. This is the reality of colonial clothing. It was a constant production cycle, a never-ending demand for textile work that consumed hours every single day. When you finally lie down at night, your hands are cramping. When you wake up in the morning, you return to the spinning wheel or the mending basket or the sewing needle. Day after day, year after year. The rhythm of your day isn't measured in hours or minutes. Those are abstractions for people with clocks. Your day is measured in tasks, in the position of the sun, in the demands of the season. Right now, in February, the work pattern is fundamentally different from what it will be in May or August. This is seasonal work, and understanding how colonial Americans lived means understanding how their entire existence shifted with the calendar. Winter work, the season you're currently in, focuses on maintenance and preparation. You're repairing tools, mending clothes, processing preserved food, and planning for spring. There's less urgency than other seasons, but it's also the hungriest, coldest time, so there's an underlying anxiety to it all. Rationing food carefully because it's still weeks away. You're checking the root cellar constantly to make sure nothing is rotting or being eaten by rats. You're watching the animals, making sure they're surviving on their stored hay and grain. The mainstream historical fact is this: colonial agricultural life followed a deeply predictable cycle dictated by climate and crop requirements. Spring meant plowing and planting, backbreaking work that started in March and continued through May. Summer meant weeding, tending crops, and harvesting early vegetables. Fall meant the frantic harvest season, preservation, and preparing for winter. Winter meant survival and planning. But here's what makes this even more complicated. Not every colonist was a farmer. Some were craftspeople, blacksmiths, coopers, carpenters, weavers. Some were merchants or tavern keepers, outside. Yet even non-farmers adjusted their schedules seasonally. A blacksmith might have more work in spring when farmers needed plowshares and tools repaired. A carpenter was busiest during building season, typically spring and summer. A merchant had the most shipping activity in summer and fall. The quirky detail is this: colonial Americans had remarkably little leisure time, but they also had a very different concept of work than we do. Work and home life weren't separated. Work wasn't something you went to. You worked in your fields next to your house. You worked in your kitchen. You worked in your workshop attached to your home. Entire family participated. Children worked alongside adults. Work was integrated into daily life in a way that's almost impossible for modern people to imagine. Historians still argue about whether colonists experienced the kind of work-related stress and burnout that modern people do. Some argue that because work was integrated into family and community life, it felt less alienating. Others suggest that the relentless physical demands, the constant threat of crop failure or starvation, and the lack of any real off time created its own kind of psychological strain. By afternoon in February, if you're a farming family, you might be checking on the animals again, hauling water, gathering firewood, or working on repairs to tools and equipment. If you're in a skilled trade, you might be in a workshop, a blacksmith's forge, a cooper's shop, a carpenter's workspace. If you're running a tavern or small shop, you're doing maintenance, keeping records, preparing for customers. The work never truly stops. Even on Sundays, when most colonists didn't work their fields or crafts out of religious obligation, there were still animals to feed, fires to tend, food to prepare, and clothes to mend. The concept of a true day off, a day with nothing to do, simply doesn't exist in colonial life. As evening approaches and the light begins to fail, there's a subtle shift in energy. The day's work isn't done, but it's winding down toward completion. You're thinking about supper. You're thinking about settling in by the fire. Tomorrow the rhythm will begin again, following its seasonal pattern, pulling you forward through another day in the endless cycle of colonial labor. This is the heartbeat of colonial existence work, measured not in hours, but in seasons, tasks, and the sun's position in the sky. You rise with dawn, you work until dusk, and you do it again tomorrow, not because someone's making you, though often someone is, but because survival requires it. Earlier this morning, you noticed your 6-year-old nephew sitting in the corner, threading a needle with surprising competence. He's been doing this for about a year now. Your 9-year-old cousin is outside helping with animal care. Your 14-year-old sister is already working the spinning wheel with enough skill that she could probably do it in her sleep. And your 16-year-old brother is in the workshop learning the trade that will define his adult life. This is childhood in colonial America, and it looks nothing like what you might imagine. The mainstream historical fact is straightforward: colonial children weren't considered precious or delicate economic units. By age 5 or 6, they were expected to begin contributing to household labor. By 10, they were doing substantial work. By 14 or 15, they were essentially functioning as adults, and many were already apprenticed out or working full-time in family enterprises. Childhood wasn't a protected period, it was a training ground. Here's the quirky detail that complicates this: children also played. They had toys, carved wooden animals, dolls made from cloth scraps, balls made from rags stuffed and stitched together. They played tag, they went swimming in summer, they had contests and games outside. They were worked hard, but they weren't worked constantly. There were moments, especially in warmer months, when play happened, and those moments mattered to them. Probably more intensely than play matters to modern children, because it was rare and less structured. Your nephew's needlework is progressing quickly because he's learning through doing, not through instruction. Someone shows him once, maybe twice, and then he's expected to get it right. If he messes up, he might be corrected or scolded, but he's not coddled. He's learning because he has to learn. This is how all skills transfer in colonial America, through observation, imitation, and repetition. If your nephew lives long enough, he'll be apprenticed to a craftsman when he hits his early teens. This is a formal arrangement. His parents will pay someone, usually several years' worth of money or goods, to take him on and teach him a trade. In exchange, he'll live with that craftsman's family, work without pay, and learn the craft. Apprenticeships typically last 7 years. During that time, he's basically indentured. He belongs to the craftsman, and running away is a serious crime. For your cousin who's outside with the animals, the path is simpler. She's learning farming and animal husbandry because she was born into it. She'll probably marry a farmer and repeat this cycle with her own children. Her education, if you can call it that, is entirely practical. Your 14-year-old sister is at a crucial point. If she's going to marry, it will probably happen within the next few years. If she's going to remain unmarried, she'll spend her life in service or with her family. There's not much middle ground. Her labor, her body, and her future are subjects of family negotiation. Historians still argue about how much childhood as a distinct life stage actually existed in colonial America. Some scholars argue that childhood was compressed or nearly non-existent. Others suggest that while colonial children worked more than modern children, they still had recognizable periods of play and development that we call childhood. The evidence is scattered and contradictory. What's undeniable is this: your 7-year-old cousin has calluses on her hands from work. She's experienced loss. Colonial childhood mortality rates were terrifyingly high, so she's probably already lost at least one sibling. She's seen birth and death firsthand. She knows how to preserve food, patch clothes, and handle animals. She's also scared sometimes and comforted sometimes, and probably has favorite games or toys that bring her joy despite everything. By this evening, she'll be exhausted. She'll eat supper alongside everyone else. She'll probably sit near the fire if it's cold, and maybe someone will tell her a story or sing something. Then she'll crawl into bed with 3 other people and fall asleep almost immediately because her body is genuinely tired from the day's work. This is childhood in colonial America, a strange blend of responsibility and resilience, labor and play, maturity forced early, and joy found in small moments. It's not a childhood you'd want, but it's the only childhood she knows. As evening falls and the household begins to settle outside, you notice your mother moving through the house with a particular kind of authority. She's not in charge in any official sense. Legally, your father owns everything, including her, but she's clearly the one orchestrating how this household functions. She decides what's cooked. She manages the textile production. She allocates tasks. She disciplines children. She negotiates with neighbors. She's running a complex operation, and everyone knows it. This is the paradox of colonial women's power: exercised enormous practical control while having almost no legal authority. The mainstream historical fact is this: colonial law followed English common law, which granted married women almost no independent legal status. A married woman's property belonged to her husband. Her wages belonged to her husband. Her children belonged to her husband. In legal terms, she was essentially a dependent, like a child or a servant. But in actual daily practice, women's roles were much more complex. They managed households that functioned as economic units. They controlled the production and distribution of food. They managed textile production and trade. Many kept small gardens or raised chickens for trade. Some were involved in midwifery, herb medicine, or other semi-professional work. Some ran taverns or shops. Some managed farms when their husbands were away or died. The quirky detail is this: when colonial women died, detailed estate inventories were sometimes created. These inventories reveal that women often had significant personal property: their own clothes, jewelry, tools, and sometimes animals or land. Where did this come from if women legally owned nothing? The answer is complicated. Some was given to them by husbands or family outside. Some was earned through their own labor or work and technically belonged to their husbands but was practically theirs. Some might have been inherited. Gap between legal status and practical reality was enormous. Your mother right now is feeding the fire, checking on the soup simmering over it, and simultaneously giving instructions to your younger siblings about tomorrow's work. She's also mentally planning the spring garden, thinking about which seeds need to be started soon, and considering whether the family can afford to trade for new cloth or whether they'll have to make do with what they have. She's managing information, making decisions, and controlling outcomes, even though legally her husband owns all of it. If you're a colonial woman listening to this, your power comes from competence and necessity. You're powerful because the household genuinely cannot function without your work. You're powerful because everyone recognizes that you know how to do things they can't do. You're powerful because you're irreplaceable, but that power is contingent. It depends entirely on your husband's willingness to let you exercise it, on your health and ability to work, and on social norms that are constantly being negotiated. Historians still argue about whether colonial women experienced their roles as empowering or constraining. Probably both, depending on the woman, her family, circumcised, and her circumstances. Some women seem to relish their authority within the household and their importance to family survival. Others left hints in letters or diaries that they resented their legal powerlessness and limited options. An unmarried colonial woman had different constraints. She might live with her family, working indefinitely without pay. She might be placed as a servant in another household. She might become a widow, a status that actually gave her more legal rights than marriage did, since widows could own property and conduct business in their own names. Some widows became remarkably powerful figures in their communities, managing farms or businesses independently. As your mother stirs the pot and checks on everyone's tasks, she's exercising a kind of quiet power that shaped colonial America profoundly. She's deciding what gets eaten, when, and in what proportion. She's deciding how resources get used. She's deciding what's possible and what's not. She doesn't have a title or official authority, but she's the infrastructure that makes everything else work. By the time full darkness falls, she'll finally sit down, probably with mending in her hands, and maybe, just maybe, she'll have a moment to herself. But even that moment will be partly about work mending, thinking, planning tomorrow. Rest, for colonial women, was rarely complete. Your father or the eldest man in your household has been working in a different space today, and his labor tells a different story than the household work you've been observing. If he's a farmer, he's been checking on the animals, repairing fences, maintaining tools, and planning the spring planting. If he's a craftsman, a blacksmith, carpenter, cooper, or mason, he's been in his workshop or traveling to job sites. If he's a merchant or trader, he's been managing inventory or negotiating with suppliers. His work defines not just his own status, but the family's social position in the community. The mainstream historical fact is this: a man's occupation was his identity in colonial America. You weren't just John. You were John the blacksmith, or John the farmer, or John the merchant. Your occupation determined your wealth, your social standing, your legal rights in some cases, and your daily rhythm. It also determined what you'd teach your sons and what kind of life they'd inherit. For a farming family, the majority of colonists, the man's labor was seasonal and intensive. In spring, plowing consumed enormous energy. A colonial plow was heavy and required strength and skill to manage. If you had oxen, you had to control them. If you had a plow but no animals, you might hire help or trade labor with neighbors. The actual plow work could take weeks depending on your farm size. Then came planting, which also required careful work. Summer meant weeding and pest management. Fall meant harvest, the most intense work season of all, when everything had to be gathered, processed, and preserved before weather made it impossible. The quirky detail is this: colonial farming was incredibly inefficient by modern standards. Most colonial farms were subsistence operations. They produced enough to feed the family and maybe a small surplus for trade or sale. Yields were low, crop failures were common, pests destroyed crops, weather was unpredictable. A single bad season could mean a year of semi-starvation. Most colonial men weren't wealthy farmers with large holdings. They were struggling to produce enough to keep their families fed. If your father is a craftsman, he's working in a different economy entirely. A blacksmith, for example, would have customers. Farmers needing tools repaired, horseshoes made, iron hardware crafted. A carpenter would be hired for building projects or repairs. A cooper would make barrels and buckets. These weren't mass-produced items. They were custom-made by skilled workers. A skilled craftsman could accumulate more wealth than a struggling farmer, but the work was still uncertain. You were only paid when customers came. Lean seasons meant lean income. A man's labor also determined his apprentices and his legacy. A father typically taught his sons his trade or profession. A farmer's son learned farming. A blacksmith's son learned blacksmithing. This wasn't always the case. Some sons were apprenticed to other craftsmen or sent to learn different trades, but the default was inheritance of profession. In this way, occupational classes were relatively stable across generations. Historians still argue about economic mobility in colonial America. Some suggest that the colonies offered more opportunity for upward mobility than England did, particularly in frontier areas where land was available. Others argue that class boundaries were remarkably rigid and that most colonists remained in roughly the same economic position their parents held. The evidence varies by region and time period. By evening, leaves outside. Your father is probably tired in a different way than the women and children who've been doing household work all day. His tiredness is the exhaustion of skilled labor or physical exertion. He might have calluses on his hands from tools. He might have burn marks if he's a blacksmith. His clothes might be stained with the evidence of his trade. He carries the physical markers of his occupation. As supper is served and the household gathers, his position at the head of the table, the best seat, the largest portion, is a physical manifestation of his role. He's the legal head of household. His word carries weight. His decisions, theoretically, are final. But in practice, he's probably negotiating with his wife about resources, listening to his older sons about their plans, and managing the complex dynamics of family and work. Later, as the household settles for the night, he might be planning tomorrow's work. If it's planting season, he's thinking about which fields to work and whether he has enough seed. If it's trade season, he's thinking about what goods to acquire or sell. His mind, like everyone else's, is on survival, sufficiency, and making it through to the next season. As darkness fully settles, someone mentions the tavern. Maybe there's talk of going there tomorrow or next week. The tavern, if your town has one, and most do, is absolutely central to colonial social life, though probably not in the way you're imagining. This isn't a place people go to get drunk and party. It's a business, a social hub, a news center, a place of negotiation and information exchange. It's basically the internet of colonial America, except instead of scrolling online, you're sitting on a bench drinking small beer and listening to travelers' stories. The mainstream historical fact is this: taverns were licensed establishments that served food and drink, but more importantly, they were gathering places where community business happened. Men met there to conduct trades, to negotiate contracts, to hear news from distant places, to discuss politics and community issues. Taverns were where militias organized. They were where court sessions sometimes happened. They were where auctions took place. A tavern keeper was often a significant figure in the community, and the tavern was a crucial institution. Most colonial taverns weren't fancy. The building was probably a wooden structure similar to homes, maybe slightly larger, was a main room with tables and benches. There might be a separate room for private meetings. The drinks served were beer, cider, rum, and occasionally wine or spirits. Food was usually simple: bread, cheese, maybe stew or meat pies. The tavern keeper's wife often did much of the cooking and serving outside. Here's the quirky detail that surprises people: taverns were also places where you might stay overnight if you were traveling. Many taverns had rooms upstairs where travelers could rent beds. These beds were often shared. You might sleep 2 or 3 to a bed with complete strangers. Cleanliness was questionable. Disease spread easily in these close quarters. But for a traveler, it was necessary infrastructure. Alternative was sleeping outside or imposing on someone's hospitality, which came with its own awkwardness. Tavern keepers had significant responsibilities, required by law to keep order, to refuse service to people who were already drunk, to not allow gambling or disorderly conduct. In practice, enforcement was loose, but the responsibility existed. A good tavern keeper was someone who could manage rowdy men, keep people from fighting, and facilitate the business that happened there without things getting completely out of hand. The tavern was also where you heard news. A traveler arriving from another town would be pumped for information about conditions elsewhere, about wars or political changes, about trade opportunities or dangers on the roads. This was how information spread before newspapers were common, and tavern keepers, hearing all this news regularly, became repositories of knowledge about what was happening in the wider world. Historians still argue about how much of colonial social life actually centered on taverns versus how much tavern records overrepresent tavern culture, because that's what survives in legal and business records. But the consensus is clear: taverns mattered enormously. They were where men negotiated, where community decisions got made, where informal governance happened alongside or sometimes instead of formal town meetings. If you're a man in colonial America, the tavern is one of the few places you can go to get away from family work. You can sit, you can talk, you can hear stories about the wider world. You're not paying much, a penny or two for a drink, But it's still money, which means it's a luxury most poor colonists couldn't indulge in regularly. Wealthier men went more often. Poor men went rarely, or participated by listening while someone else bought the drinks. If you're a woman, sighed. You'd only go to a tavern if you were working there as the keeper's wife or daughter, helping to serve. Women as customers in taverns would have been unusual and probably somewhat scandalous. The tavern was a male space, though not exclusively. By evening, if there's talk of going to the tavern tomorrow, it's probably because someone has business to discuss or news to share. Maybe a traveler came through recently. Maybe there's a community meeting scheduled there. Maybe your father just needs to get out of the house and talk to other men for a while. Whatever the reason, the tavern represents a break in routine, a connection to the wider world, and a rare moment of social life that isn't centered on family labor. The tavern talk reminds you that market day is coming soon, probably next week, depending on whether the weather holds and the roads are passable. Market day is when your small town or village transforms temporarily into a bustling trade hub. Farmers come in from outlying areas. Merchants arrive with goods from distant places. Craftspeople display their wares. Money actually changes hands. It's one of the most exciting days of the colonial calendar, which says something about how quiet and isolated daily life usually is. The mainstream historical fact is these colonial trade networks were remarkably extensive despite the lack of modern transportation. Goods moved from the Caribbean to New England, to Virginia, to the interior through a complex system of merchant networks, tavern exchanges, and community trading. A colonial family might own items that came from Africa, the Caribbean, England, or other colonies. These networks were informal, based on family connections, merchant relationships, and personal trust, but they were functional and surprisingly robust. You're probably looking forward to market day because it means new goods might be available. Maybe cloth you can't make yourself. Maybe metal tools. Maybe exotic items like sugar, molasses, or spices. Maybe news from the outside world. Maybe the chance to see people from other towns. Maybe the chance to sell something your family produced, surplus vegetables, preserved goods, cloth your mother made, or animals your father fattened over the winter. The quirky detail is this: colonial markets weren't like modern farmers' markets. There were no fixed stalls or permanent infrastructure. People just gathered in the town square or a designated area, laid out their goods, and started trading. A merchant might sell from a large cloth spread on the ground. A farmer might bring a wagon of goods. A craftsperson might display items on a table or hold them up to show people. Organization was minimal. Chaos was common. Prices weren't fixed. Everything was negotiable. You haggled. You bartered. You might trade your preserved vegetables for cloth. You might trade cloth for tools. You might trade labor, promising to work for someone for a set period. For goods or money, currency existed, but it wasn't always plentiful. So barter and credit were incredibly common. Much of colonial trade happened on credit, with debts recorded informally or in account books, settled later or never fully settled. Colonial merchants were middlemen who bought goods from producers and sold them to consumers, usually at a significant markup. They were often involved in shipping goods longer distances, trading with other colonies, the Caribbean, or occasionally Europe. A successful merchant could accumulate considerable wealth and power. Historians still argue about how capitalistic or market-oriented colonial economics really were. Some scholars emphasize the market networks and the profit motive. Others argue that colonial economies were based much more on subsistence, necessity, and local mutual obligation than on market transactions. The evidence suggests both were operating simultaneously. Markets existed and mattered, but most colonists still lived primarily on what they produced themselves and what they could trade locally for necessities. By the time market day arrives, your mother has probably been planning for weeks. She's made sure there's surplus to trade. Maybe extra preserved vegetables, maybe cloth or yarn. She's discussed with your father what the family needs most badly. She's mentally inventoried what you have and what you lack. Market day is when decisions get made about what resources will come into the household for the next several months. If you attend market day, and you probably do, you experience something resembling abundance. There are more people than you usually see, are more goods than you usually see. There's energy and excitement. There are opportunities to buy or trade for things you want. There's the possibility of news, gossip, and information from beyond your immediate community. By evening, after market day, you return home with whatever was acquired. Maybe new cloth, maybe tools, maybe luxury items like sugar for a special occasion. These goods will be carefully managed and portioned. The cloth might not be used immediately but stored for when the family's current garments are completely worn out. The tools will be absorbed into the workflow. The luxuries will be rationed and celebrated. Market day represents the connection between your isolated household economy and the wider colonial trade networks. It's a glimpse into a larger world of commerce and exchange, and then you return to the quiet, self-sufficient work of maintaining your household until the next market day arrives. As you settle near the fire after supper, someone coughs. It's a wet, rattling sound that echoes slightly in the quiet house. Someone else clears their throat. Your younger sibling has had that cough for 3 weeks now. Nobody said much about it, but everyone's noticed. In colonial America, coughs are terrifying because they can mean consumption, tuberculosis, which is basically a death sentence, or they can mean pneumonia, which is also often fatal, or they can just mean a cold. There's no way to know, and that uncertainty is part of the background anxiety of colonial life. The mainstream historical fact is stark. Disease was the primary killer in colonial America. More colonists died from illness than from any other cause, including childbirth, accidents, and violence combined. Dysentery, malaria, yellow fever, tuberculosis, influenza, and various unnamed fevers killed constantly. Mortality rates were terrifyingly high. A newborn had maybe a 30% chance of not surviving to adulthood. If you survived childhood, you might live to 60 or 70, but you'd likely lose multiple children along the way. Colonial medicine was almost useless. Doctors existed, but they were expensive and their treatments were often harmful or ineffective. They believed in balancing bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Treatment involved bloodletting, purging, or inducing vomiting. None of this actually helped. Most people relied on folk remedies and prayer instead. Here's the quirky detail. Colonial folk medicine was actually sometimes effective, though nobody understood why. Willow bark contained salicylates similar to aspirin. Certain herbs had genuine antimicrobial properties. Garlic, onions, and other pungent plants were thought to have medicinal value, and some actually did. But alongside effective remedies were completely useless or harmful ones. The entire system was a mix of occasional effectiveness and magical thinking. If someone in your household got seriously ill, the response would be prayer, folk remedies, and hoping. If it was someone with resources, maybe a doctor would be called, and his bloodletting and purging would probably hasten death rather than prevent it. If it was someone poor, they'd just get sick, maybe recover, maybe die, and life would continue. Colonial households developed expertise in treating common illnesses. Your mother probably knows which herbs help with fevers. She probably knows how to make poultices, teas, and treatments that seemed to help in the past. She's probably delivered babies for neighbors, helped people through illnesses, and laid out the dead. Medical knowledge was practical, experiential, and passed down through women primarily. Though men sometimes had formal medical training, historians still argue about how colonists understood disease. Some suggest they had genuine germ theory concepts, noticing that disease spread and trying to prevent it through isolation or cleanliness. Others argue that colonists understood disease primarily through moral or spiritual lenses. Illness as punishment or divine testing. The evidence suggests elements of both approaches existed simultaneously. The cough that your sibling has might resolve on its own. Coughs often did. Or it might develop into something more serious. There's nothing you can do about it except hope and try home remedies. You'll probably be given some herbal tea. Someone might prepare a poultice to put on your chest. You'll be encouraged to rest more, though rest is a luxury when there's work to be done. What nobody talks about openly is the fear underneath. Every cough, every fever, every outbreak of illness in the community carries the possibility of death. You've seen it before. You know what it looks like. You know how quickly illness can progress. You know that winter is the worst season for illness. Cold, damp houses, close quarters, bodies weakened by inadequate nutrition. By the time you're trying to sleep later tonight, you're probably listening to that cough in the darkness, wondering if it means anything, knowing that you can't really do anything about it except wait and see. This is colonial medical reality: helplessness, fear, and the constant presence of death as a possible outcome of any illness. The cough your sibling has reminds you that death is never far away in colonial life. It's not morbid to think about it constantly. It's realistic. Someone in your community dies regularly. Sometimes it's from illness. Sometimes it's from accident or injury. Sometimes it's childbirth complications. Sometimes it's just old age, though people rarely got old. Death is ordinary as breakfast, and the rituals around it are deeply embedded in community life. When someone dies, the process moves quickly. The body is washed and wrapped in a shroud, usually a simple linen sheet. There's no embalming. There's no delay. The funeral typically happens within a day or two because bodies decompose rapidly, especially in warm weather. If it's winter, the body might be kept slightly longer, but not much. The community gathers. Neighbors, family, people from church. There's a funeral service, often brief. The body is buried in the churchyard or a family burial ground. The mainstream historical fact is this: colonial funerals were significant community events. They drew people together. They reaffirmed community bonds and religious belief. They were also opportunities for display of status. Wealthier families might have larger funerals, more elaborate shrouds, or more people attending. The funeral was one of the few occasions where social hierarchy was visibly enacted through ritual. Grave digging was difficult work, especially in winter when the ground was frozen. A gravedigger might need to build fires to thaw the earth before digging. Graves were dug shallowly by modern standards, maybe 3 or 4 feet deep. Coffins were sometimes used by wealthier families, but poorer colonists were often buried directly in shrouds. The graves were marked, sometimes with stones or wooden markers, sometimes with just a mound of earth. Over time, markers deteriorated or disappeared. Colonial graveyards contain hundreds of unmarked graves where people were simply forgotten. Here's the quirky detail. Colonial burial practices varied significantly by region and religion. Puritan communities in New England had relatively simple burials with minimal ceremony. Anglican communities might have more elaborate services. Catholic colonists had their own traditions. Enslaved people often had separate burial areas and different practices. Native American burial practices were different still, though colonists often disrupted or attempted to change them. Death was universal, but how you died and how you were buried depended enormously on who you were. If you're a woman who dies in childbirth, a common fate, your funeral acknowledges the cause. If you're a child who dies from disease, your funeral is quieter and perhaps more emotionally devastating privately, though publicly it might be treated as almost routine because child death was so common. If you're someone who dies from violence or accident, there might be more discussion and investigation. If you're enslaved and you die, you might receive minimal ceremony or acknowledgement. Historians still argue about how colonists processed grief. Did they experience it differently than modern people? Some scholars suggest that because death was so common, grief was more muted or ritualized. Others argue that the high frequency of loss meant grief was constant and profound, just expressed differently than modern grief. Letters and diaries suggest that colonists grieved intensely, wrote about loss poignantly, and carried deep sadness about people they'd lost. After a funeral continues almost immediately, the work doesn't pause for grief. The household still needs food. The animals still need care. The crops still need tending. Grief gets absorbed into the ongoing labor. You mourn, but you also keep working. If it was a productive member of the household who died, a parent or older sibling, the loss creates real practical hardship. The family must reorganize. That person gets redistributed. If it was a child or elderly person, the loss is emotionally devastating, but not create the same practical crisis. Cemeteries are spaces where colonists confront mortality constantly. If your church has a graveyard, you see it regularly. You see generations of graves. You see how many children died. You see how death has shaped your community over decades. You know many of the people in those graves. Walking through a colonial graveyard is walking through your own community's history of loss. By the time you're settling into sleep tonight, outside, you've probably thought about death multiple times. You've thought about the cuff your sibling has. You've thought about people you knew who died, outside. You've thought about your own mortality. This isn't depression or pessimism, it's just realistic awareness of the world you live in. Death is a neighbor. It's close. It could come tomorrow. As you lie in the darkness, you hear the church bell ringing in the distance, a sound that marks time in colonial life. Tomorrow is Sunday, which means church. And church in colonial America isn't something you attend casually or skip if you're not feeling it. Church attendance is mandatory in most colonies. Missing church without a legitimate excuse can result in fines or public punishment. Church is where you practice religion, yes, but it's also where law is announced, where community business gets conducted, where social hierarchy is physically displayed, and where you're observed and judged by everyone who matters in your community. The mainstream historical fact is straightforward: churches were central institutions in colonial communities, and clergy held enormous authority. Ministers were educated, respected figures who wielded influence over spiritual, moral, and sometimes political matters. Church doctrine shaped how people understood the world, their place in it, their obligations to God and community. For Puritan colonies especially, church and community governance were deeply intertwined. Sunday worship follows a pattern. Arrive at the meeting house, a wooden building, usually plain and unadorned, heated minimally or not at all. You sit according to social rank. Wealthier families sit in better positioned pews or boxes. Poorer people sit in the back or stand. Men typically sit separately from women. Children sit with their mothers. The service is long, often 2 to 3 hours, consisting of prayers, psalm singing, and a sermon. The sermon is the main event, and it's typically intense, emotionally charged, and focused on sin, redemption, and God's judgment. The quirky detail is this: colonial church services had almost no musical instruments. Organ music was rare and considered by many to be too worldly or frivolous. Singing was a cappella, often out of tune, sometimes chaotic, but people sang anyway. Psalm singing was a form of community participation and religious expression that almost everyone engaged in, even those who couldn't read the words. During the sermon, the minister might call out specific sins or moral failures he's observed in the community. Sermons were often accusatory and judgment-focused. They emphasized human depravity, God's wrath, and the constant possibility of damnation. If you were living in a particularly strict Puritan community, sermons could be psychologically devastating, designed to create anxiety about your moral state and drive you toward greater piety and moral behavior. After the service, there might be time for conversation, though behavior was expected to be decorous. You couldn't just chat casually. This was still a religious space and a formal occasion. You might discuss news or make arrangements with neighbors, but everything happened under the watchful eye of the minister and respected community members. Historians still argue about how much genuine religious belief shaped colonial behavior versus how much religious conformity was enforced through social pressure and legal requirement. Some colonists were deeply, genuinely pious. Others conformed publicly while maintaining private skepticism. Many probably existed somewhere in between, believing some elements of church teaching while having doubts about others. What's clear is that church shaped daily life profoundly. The 10 Commandments, the Catechism, biblical stories, these provided the moral framework that colonists used to understand the world. Breaking the Sabbath, lying, adultery, theft. These were sins with both spiritual and social consequences. Church teaching justified hierarchy, gender roles, and social inequality as divinely ordained. If you're in a community with an especially strict minister, Sunday might also be a day of severe limitation. No work, no traveling, no cooking beyond what was absolutely necessary, no amusement, no leisure. The entire day is devoted to religion and rest. In less strict communities, the limitations were more relaxed. You could do some work, you could move around, you could engage in some leisure activities. By Sunday evening, after church, and after the day of relative rest, you're probably thinking about the week ahead. Monday will bring the return to intense labor. But for now, you've fulfilled your religious obligation. You've participated in community worship. You've been observed and assessed by your community. You've received moral instruction and spiritual warning. You're ready, or at least resigned, to begin another week of work and survival. Back at home after church, you notice that your younger cousin is asking questions about letters and numbers. Someone, probably your mother or an older sibling, is trying to teach her to read, but the reality is that most colonial children never learned to read or write. Literacy was a luxury, something that required time and resources that most families couldn't spare, and it had to be deliberately taught. There were no schools in most colonies. Education happened at home, informally, if it happened at all. The mainstream historical fact is this: literacy rates in colonial America varied significantly by region, gender, and social class. In New England, literacy rates for men were relatively high, maybe 50 to 70% by the late colonial period. In the middle colonies and South, rates were lower. For women, literacy was much lower across all regions, maybe 20 to 30% in New England, even lower elsewhere. For enslaved people and poor colonists, literacy was rare and sometimes actively discouraged. If your family had resources and wanted you to be educated, you might attend a grammar school, which was a private school that charged tuition. These schools taught reading, writing, arithmetic, and classical languages to boys primarily. Girls were rarely admitted. If you couldn't afford school, education happened at home through informal apprenticeship and practical instruction. You learned what you needed to know to do your job. A farmer learned farming. A craftsperson learned their craft, and most people learned enough reading and arithmetic to get by, if they learned anything at all. Here's the quirky detailing: literacy wasn't always necessary for success. You could conduct business, manage a farm, run a household, and participate fully in colonial society without being able to read or write. Many colonists marked documents with an X instead of a signature. They relied on oral contracts and community witnesses. They used verbal instruction and demonstration to pass knowledge. Written materials existed, but they weren't essential for most people's daily functioning. That said, literacy was valuable and respected. People who could read were recognized as educated and elevated in status. Ministers were always literate. Merchants needed to be literate to keep records. Educated men had more opportunities and more power. So while literacy wasn't necessary for survival, it was definitely advantageous. If your family could afford to send a boy to school or apprentice him to someone who'd teach him a skilled trade, that was an investment in his future. If they couldn't afford it, and most couldn't, he'd learn through watching and doing. If you're a girl, education is even less likely. You'll learn household management from your mother. You'll learn whatever craft or trade is relevant to your future. You probably won't learn to read unless someone in your family decides to teach you, and even then, it's not guaranteed. Apprenticeship is the primary educational institution for most colonists. Starting around age 13 or 14, a boy is bound to a skilled craftsperson, a blacksmith, carpenter, cooper, tailor, or other trade worker. The apprenticeship typically lasts 7 years. During those years, he lives with the craftsperson's family, works without pay, and learns the trade through doing. He's not allowed to leave. He's basically indentured. But at the end of the apprenticeship, he's a trained craftsperson capable of earning a living. Historians still argue about how effective apprenticeship was as an educational system. Some scholars emphasize that it successfully transmitted practical skills and knowledge. Others note that apprentices were often exploited, worked hard, and taught minimally. The experience probably varied tremendously depending on the apprentice, the master, and the specific trade. By the time you're an adult, your education, whatever it was, is complete. You know what you need to know to function in your role. If you needed more knowledge, you'd find ways to acquire it through experience or conversation. But formal education typically ends in adolescence. The rest of your life is learning through doing. Your cousin asking about letters is engaging in something that most colonial children would never pursue. If she's being taught to read, it's either because her family has unusual resources or because someone in the household thinks she has particular potential, or because the family is unusual in valuing education for girls. Most likely, she'll learn basic household management and then focus on becoming a good wife and mother. Reading might come later, or never. As you settle into the evening after church, and the light begins to fade, someone brings out a musical instrument, maybe a simple wooden flute, maybe a fiddle, maybe just a drum made from hollowed wood and stretched animal skin. Music happens in colonial households, and it's one of the few forms of entertainment that doesn't require money or sophisticated resources. Someone knows how to play something, or someone can at least sing, and music fills the evening in a way that's become essential to making life bearable. The mainstream historical fact is this: colonial Americans loved music and found ways to make it despite limited resources, and in strict religious communities, active discouragement of frivolous entertainment. Music happened at home, at taverns, at community gatherings, and at celebrations. It was a form of social bonding, emotional expression, and pure enjoyment. People sang while working. They sang in church. They made music together in the evenings. The instruments available to colonial people were usually homemade or imported and expensive. Fiddles existed and were played, particularly in communities with Scottish or Irish immigrants. Flutes and recorders were simpler and more affordable. Drums could be made relatively easily. Pipes and other wind instruments appeared occasionally, but for most colonists, the primary instrument was the human voice. Singing required no money, no resources, just the ability to remember words and melodies. Here's the quirky detail: colonial music was extremely diverse and regional. Communities with English settlers sang English folk songs and ballads. Communities with Scottish or Irish settlers had different musical traditions. German communities had their own music. Spanish and French colonial areas had different musical cultures entirely. African enslaved people brought their own musical traditions, which blended with European and Native American traditions to create something new. Colonial music was constantly evolving through cultural contact and mixing. Dances were significant social events, though they were frowned upon by strict religious communities. A dance might happen at a tavern, at a community gathering, or at a celebration like a wedding or harvest festival. Dances were opportunities for young people to socialize, for communities to gather, and for pure joy and movement. They were also potentially scandalous. Dancing was associated with worldliness and sin in Puritan theology, so conservative communities restricted dancing or prohibited it entirely. If you're listening to music in your household tonight, you're experiencing one of the few forms of entertainment available. There are no movies, no television, no radio, no recorded music. There are no books for entertainment. Most people don't have books at all. There are no games beyond simple children's games. Music and storytelling are the primary forms of entertainment. Stories about local events, family history, adventures from travelers, folklore and legends. These are the stories people tell, and music accompanies many of these stories. Historians still argue about what role music played in colonial emotional life. Did music provide genuine psychological relief from the hardship and stress of daily existence? Probably yes. Music is a form of expression and connection that transcends practical necessity. It speaks to something in human nature that needs beauty and joy alongside survival and work. Entertainment, broadly speaking, was limited and often had to be self-created. You entertained yourself through conversation, through work that could be social, through games, through music and storytelling, through seasonal celebrations and community gatherings. You didn't expect to be entertained by external sources. You created your own entertainment within your community and household. As you listen to music tonight, whether it's someone playing a fiddle or a group singing together, you're participating in something ancient and universal. You're finding joy in sound and rhythm. You're connecting with other people through shared cultural expression. You're experiencing one of the few moments in your day when survival and work aren't the only things that matter. Tomorrow the work begins again. The winter continues. The cold persists. The food situation remains precarious. But tonight, for a while, you have music. You have community. You have something that makes life more than just grinding survival. This is entertainment in colonial America. Simple, communal, and deeply valued precisely because everything else is so demanding and joyless. As you drift towards sleep, your mind carries a weight that most modern people rarely experience. You know people who are enslaved. You might live in a southern colony where slavery is openly practiced and economically central. Or you might live in the north, where you think slavery is less common and less brutal. But here's what you need to understand: slavery exists in the northern colonies too. It's not as visually dominant as it is in the South, but it's present and significant. And if you're living through colonial America, you're living in a society built partly on enslaved labor. The mainstream historical fact is this: northern colonists enslaved people. They enslaved Africans and Native Americans. The numbers were smaller than in southern colonies, but the practice was widespread and accepted. New England merchants grew wealthy partly through the slave trade, buying enslaved people in Africa, selling them in the Caribbean, bringing sugar and molasses back to the colonies. Northern enslavers used enslaved people for domestic work, skilled labor, farm work, and maritime labor. Slavery wasn't a southern peculiarity. It was a colonial reality. The enslaved people in northern colonies lived different daily lives than enslaved people in the South, but they lived lives of fundamental unfreedom. An enslaved person in a New England town might live in a household working as a domestic servant or farmhand. They might be skilled, a carpenter, blacksmith, or other craftsperson, but they were property. They could be bought, sold, inherited, or rented out. They had no legal rights. Their children, if born to an enslaved mother, were automatically enslaved. Here's the quirky detail that complicates the narrative: some northern colonists, particularly Quakers and some religious communities, were beginning to question slavery morally by the late colonial period. They were rare, but they existed outside. Some enslaved people in the North were able to gain freedom through their owner's choice, through their own efforts, or through legal action. Free black people existed in the northern colonies, though their freedom was precarious and their rights were limited. But these exceptions don't change the fundamental reality: northern colonists enslaved people, and slavery was woven into the colonial economy and society. If you're white and living in the North, you might not think about slavery constantly. It's not as visible as it would be in the South, but you're still living in a society built partly on enslaved labor. You might see an enslaved person working in someone's household. You might know that ships from your town are involved in the slave trade. You might even own an enslaved person if your family has resources. The reality of slavery is present even if it's not constantly visible. If you're an enslaved person in the North, your daily life involves unfreedom in every moment. You work without pay. Your time is controlled by someone else. You have minimal legal protection. You could be separated from family members through sale. You live with the constant awareness that you're property, not a person with rights. Historians still argue about regional differences in slavery and whether northern slavery was somehow milder or more human than southern slavery. Some scholars argue that northern enslaved people had slightly better conditions or more opportunities for eventual freedom. Others argue that slavery was slavery, fundamentally brutal and dehumanizing regardless of region. The evidence suggests both arguments contain truth. Northern slavery did differ in some ways from southern slavery, but it was still slavery, still a system of complete domination and unfreedom. What's important to understand as you drift towards sleep is that the colonial America you're living in is built on multiple systems of exploitation and unfreedom. Indigenous people are being displaced and killed. Enslaved people are being worked without pay or rights. Indentured servants are bound to masters for years. The vast majority of colonists, free white people, have limited rights and freedom too, though more than enslaved or indigenous people. This is the society you're part of. This is normal to you, even if it's horrifying to people in the future. By the time sleep finally comes, you're carrying the weight of this knowledge unconsciously. You live in a society built on slavery and dispossession. You've accepted it as normal. Most colonists do. Few question it. Those who do are rare and often dismissed. This is colonial reality, not just the individual household struggles and the daily labor, but the larger system of exploitation that makes colonial society possible. But slavery isn't the only form of unfreedom shaping colonial life. As you're finally drifting towards sleep, consider the situation of indentured servants, people who are bound by contract to serve a master for a set period, usually 4 to 7 years. These are often poor people from England or other places who couldn't afford passage to the colonies. They sold their labor for a set period in exchange for transportation, food, housing, and the promise of freedom dues. Money or goods given to them when their indenture ended. The mainstream historical fact is this: indentured servitude was enormously common in colonial America, particularly in the 17th century. It's estimated that between 50 and 75% of European immigrants to the colonies came as indentured servants. They were young, poor, desperate. They signed contracts that gave their masters complete control over their labor, their movement, and basic aspects of their lives for years. The conditions of indenture varied. Some indentured servants were treated relatively well and learned a trade during their service. Others were brutally exploited, worked excessively, underfed, beaten, and given minimal training or compensation. When the indenture ended, some successfully transitioned to freedom and eventually property ownership. Others struggled economically for the rest of their lives or died before completing their service. Here's the quirky detail that most people don't realize: indentured servitude was actually the origin point of racial slavery in the colonies. In the early 17th century, labor was labor. European servants and African servants worked alongside each other. But gradually, throughout the 17th century, the legal status of African servants began to shift. Africans began to be enslaved for life, while European servants remained indentured for set terms. This legal distinction eventually hardened into racial slavery. Race, as we understand it, was literally created through this legal distinction. It didn't exist before slavery. Slavery created it. An indentured servant in your household, and many households had them, is in a strange position. They're not enslaved, but they're not free either. They have some legal protections that enslaved people don't have. They can potentially run away and seek legal recourse. That's rare and dangerous. They have a defined end date to their service, but during their service, they belong to their master. Their time, labor, and movement are controlled. They often can't marry without permission. They can't own property. They're basically rented humans. If you're an indentured servant, daily life involves constant work and minimal autonomy. You're working someone else's land, living in their household, eating what they provide. If you're lucky, leave side. You're learning a skill that will help you after indenture. If you're unlucky, you're just being exploited until your contract ends or you die. Death before indenture completion was common. Disease, accidents, exhaustion, or violence killed many indentured servants. Historians still argue about the experiences of indentured servants and whether their conditions were truly as brutal as slavery, or whether they occupied a fundamentally different category. The evidence suggests that while indentured servitude was different from slavery in important legal ways, the lived experience could be similarly harsh. But the key difference was the endpoint. Indenture had a defined end. Slavery did not. By the late colonial period, indentured servitude was declining and being replaced by racial slavery. European immigration was increasing, and colonists were importing more African enslaved people rather than relying on indentured European servants. This shift wasn't accidental or natural. It was deliberate. Colonists chose slavery over indentured servitude for economic reasons. Slavery was more profitable because it was permanent and heritable. It was also reinforced through racist ideology that portrayed Africans as naturally suited for slavery in ways that Europeans were not. So as you're settling into sleep, understand that unfreedom surrounds you in multiple forms. Some people are enslaved. Some people are indentured. Most free colonists have limited rights compared to modern standards. They can be drafted for militia service. They can be taxed. Limited legal recourse against powerful people. Freedom in colonial America is relative, conditional, and distributed unequally based on race, class, and gender. The colonial society you're living in is built on multiple layers of control and unfreedom, with enslaved people at the absolute bottom and wealthy white men at the top. The questions of freedom and unfreedom become even more complicated. When you consider the racial categories that are being constructed during your lifetime, what does it mean to be black or white in colonial America? The answer is that these categories are being invented, debated, and enforced through law and practice as the colonial period progresses. They're not natural or predetermined, they're being created. The mainstream historical fact is this: racial categories in colonial America were fluid and evolving throughout the 17th and early 18th centuries. In the early 1600s, colonists terms like Christian, heathen, Negro, Indian, and English to categorize people, but these categories didn't always correspond to race as we understand it. Someone could be African and Christian and free. Someone could be Native American and enslaved. The categories were based on religion, origin, and legal status more than on physical appearance, or what we'd call race. But gradually, throughout the 17th century, the categories shifted and hardened. Black and white became legal and social categories. Laws were written specifically to regulate the behavior and status of black people. By the early 18th century, race as we understand it, as a category based primarily on skin color and ancestry, carrying legal and social implications, was becoming the dominant way colonists understood human difference. Here's the quirky detail that reveals how constructed these categories were. Some colonists were uncertain how to categorize mixed race people, people from different regions, or people whose ancestry was ambiguous. Should someone with one African parent and one English parent be classified as black or white? Should someone from Brazil or the Caribbean be classified differently than someone from Africa? These questions reveal that racial categories weren't obvious or natural. They had to be negotiated and decided through law and social practice. If you're a colonist witnessing this process, you might not recognize it as the creation of race. You might think you're simply observing natural human differences or organizing society based on practical considerations. But what's actually happening is that colonists are actively constructing racial categories and investing them with legal meaning. A person classified as black has different legal rights and obligations than someone classified as white. These differences are being codified in law. By the early 18th century, laws exist that regulate marriage between races, that punish interracial sexual relationships, that determine the status of children based on their mother's race, and that restrict the freedom and rights of black people regardless of their status or behavior. These laws are creating race, defining it, enforcing it, making it real through legal power. Historians still argue about exactly when race became the primary organizing principle of colonial society and when it replaced religion, national origin, legal status as the main way colonists categorized people. Some scholars point to the 1660s or 1670s as the turning point. Others argue the process was more gradual. What's clear is that by 1700, race as we understand it had become a central organizing principle of colonial law and society. For a person living through this transformation, implications are profound. If you're African or of African descent, you're increasingly being classified as naturally suited for slavery, naturally inferior, naturally different. These ideas are being encoded in law and reinforced through practice and ideology. If you're European, you're being classified as naturally free, naturally suited for rights and property ownership, naturally superior. These categories are being made real through repeated assertion, legal enforcement, and social practice. The process isn't complete in the early colonial period. It's still evolving, still being negotiated, but the direction is clear. By the time the American Revolution happens, racial slavery based on African ancestry will be firmly entrenched in colonial law and practice, particularly in the southern colonies. And the racial categories that seem so natural and obvious to modern people, that divide the world into black and white and other races, will have been thoroughly constructed and embedded in legal systems and social practice. Right outside, as you're drifting towards sleep, you're living through the moment when these categories are being formed. You might not recognize it as such. It might just seem like the way society is organized. But what's actually happening is that colonists are inventing race, making it real through law and practice, and using it to justify slavery and inequality. Your household exists at the edge of the colonial world, and that edge is a space of constant tension and danger. Somewhere beyond your fields, beyond the settled areas, are Native Americans, the people who actually lived on this land before colonists arrived. The relationship between colonists and Native Americans is complex, varied and shaped by trade, violence, disease, and fundamental incompatibility of worldviews. If you're living in a frontier area, this tension is immediate and felt daily. If you're living in a more established colonial settlement, it's more distant but still present in stories, fears, and occasional violence. The mainstream historical fact is the colonist-Native American relations varied tremendously by region and time period. In some areas, particularly early on, there was significant trade and cultural exchange. In other areas, conflict and violence were constant. By the 18th century, in most areas, Native Americans had been displaced or killed, and surviving populations were pushed to the margins of colonial society. Disease was catastrophic for Native American populations when colonists arrived with European diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, to which Native Americans had no immunity. Epidemics killed enormous percentages of the population. In some regions, diseases killed 90% or more of the Native American population. These deaths weren't intentional in most cases, but they had intentional consequences. They devastated Native American societies, weakened their ability to resist colonization, and made it easier for colonists to take land. Here's the quirky detail that reveals the complexity. Some colonists genuinely tried to coexist with Native Americans. Some traded fairly. Some learned Native American languages. Some married Native American people. Some colonists were captured by Native Americans and chose to stay. But these cross-cultural connections existed alongside, and were often overwhelmed by colonist violence, land theft, and cultural destruction. Native Americans were pushed out, killed, or forced into dependence on colonial society. If you're living in a frontier area, outside, you probably have complicated feelings about Native Americans. You might fear them because you've heard stories of violence or raids. You might trade with them because they have valuable goods like furs. You might feel that they're obstacles to settlement and expansion. You probably don't think of yourself as an invader or colonizer. You just think you're living your life, building your community, and defending yourself against threat. From your perspective, colonization is normal and necessary. From the Native American perspective, it's catastrophic dispossession and cultural destruction. Contact zones, spaces where colonists and Native Americans interacted regularly, were places of negotiation, trade, and also danger. A trading post might be a space where peaceful exchange happened. A frontier settlement might be a place where violence erupted. These spaces were unstable and constantly shifting based on events, relationships, and circumstances. Historians still argue about the possibility of different colonial, Native American relationships. Could colonization have happened differently? Could coexistence have been possible? Some scholars argue that colonization and Native American displacement were inevitable given the numbers and resources involved. Others argue that different choices by colonists, different policies, different attitudes, different treatment, could have led to different outcomes. The evidence is ambiguous. What's clear is that the colonial American future was built on Native American dispossession. The land colonists were farming, the towns they were building, the communities they were establishing. All of these existed because Native Americans had been removed, killed, or pushed to the margins. Colonization was a process of replacement. If you're a colonist in a frontier area, you might occasionally encounter Native Americans directly. You might trade with them or see them at a market. You might hear stories about raids or violence. You might feel fear about the possibility of attack. You might also feel a kind of grim inevitability, a sense that Native Americans are being replaced by colonial settlement and that this is simply how history works. By the time you're settling into sleep tonight, you're living in a colonial society that's built on Native dispossession and continuing to expand and take more land. You're probably not thinking about this consciously. You're just living your life, doing your work, surviving. But your survival is taking place on land taken from people who died or were forced away, and that displacement is ongoing and expanding. As you think about the land you're living on and the animals you're raising, you're reminded that animals are absolutely central to colonial life. They're not companions or pets. They're infrastructure. They're survival tools. They're wealth outside, and your daily relationship with them is fundamentally different from how modern people relate to animals. The mainstream historical fact is this: colonial households typically had multiple animals: chickens, cows, oxen, horses, or sheep depending on wealth and region. These animals provided food, labor, transportation, and materials for clothing and tools. A cow provided milk and eventually meat and hide. Oxen provided labor for plowing. Horses provided transportation. Chickens provided eggs and meat. Pigs provided meat and fat. Sheep provided wool. Every animal had a practical purpose. Your relationship with these animals is utilitarian but also intimate. You see them daily. You care for them. You know their individual personalities and behaviors. But you also don't anthropomorphize them or see them as having inherent rights or value beyond their utility. When an animal gets old or sick, you eat it or let it die. When an animal is useful, you maintain it. When an animal dies, you use every part: meat for food, bones for tools, hide for leather, fat for candles and soap. Here's the quirky detail: colonial people sometimes develop genuine affection for animals even while viewing them as tools. Letters and diaries reveal people caring about their horses, mourning animals that died, and treating particular animals with what seems like genuine kindness. At the same time, they'd sell an animal or slaughter it without apparent emotional difficulty. This combination of affection and utility is hard for modern people to understand, but it was completely normal in colonial life. If you own a horse, you're relatively wealthy. Horses were expensive and required resources to maintain. A horse could be ridden, could pull a cart or plow, and represented significant wealth and status. Losing a horse was a serious blow to a household's prosperity. Many colonists walked or used oxen instead, which were slower but more reliable and less expensive. Oxen were crucial for plowing. A pair of oxen could work fields that would be impossible to farm without animal labor. Training oxen required skill and patience. You had to teach them to respond to commands, to work together, to maintain pace and direction. A good teamster, someone skilled at working with oxen, was valuable. Young men often learned this skill as part of becoming capable farmers. Pigs were common because they were efficient converters of food waste into meat and fat. You could feed a pig kitchen scraps and waste, and it would gain weight and provide meat. Pigs didn't require specialized care or feeding like horses did. They could survive on minimal resources. Chickens were incredibly common because they required minimal resources and provided eggs and meat. Even poor households sometimes had a few chickens. Eggs were a protein source and could be traded or sold. Chicken meat was less valuable than larger animals, but it was still significant. Historians still argue about how colonists understood animal welfare and whether they had any ethical framework for treating animals humanly. Some scholars argue that colonists simply saw animals as tools and didn't think much about their suffering or welfare. Others argue that colonists had their own frameworks for treating animals decently, even if those frameworks were very different from modern animal welfare concepts. Evidence suggests colonists varied. Some seemed to care about animal welfare, others seemed indifferent to suffering. By the end of your day, you've probably interacted with multiple animals, feeding them, moving them, managing them in some way. They're part of your household as surely as family members are, though their status is fundamentally different. They're there to serve you, and you maintain them as long as they're useful. As evening falls, the animals settle down for the night. The chickens roost. The cow is in the barn or pen. The horse, if you have one, is sheltered. The pigs are in their enclosure. The animals' needs have been met for the day. Tomorrow, you'll begin again, feeding, watering, managing, and maintaining the animals that make your survival possible outside. Now that evening has fully fallen and you're thinking about settling into sleep, you're becoming acutely aware of something that modern people rarely experience: the smell of colonial life. It's not pleasant. It's overwhelming, actually. A complex mixture of human waste, animal waste, smoke, unwashed bodies, spoiled food, and general filth that seems to permeate everything. The mainstream historical fact is straightforward: colonial towns and households were filthy by modern standards. There were no sewage systems, no indoor plumbing, no regular garbage collection. Human waste went into chamber pots or outhouses. Animal waste accumulated in pens and barns. Food waste was thrown outside or fed to pigs. Wastewater was dumped in the street or nearby. The smell would have been genuinely overwhelming to a modern person. Town or village probably has a particular smell depending on what's happening. In warm months, the smell worse because waste decomposes faster. In winter, the smell is somewhat reduced, though the cold doesn't eliminate it entirely. The smell is worse near the outhouses, the animal pens, and the areas where waste accumulates. But the smell is everywhere to some degree because there's nowhere for waste to go except into the immediate environment. Disease followed this filth. Dysentery, cholera, typhoid, and other diseases spread through contaminated water and food. Most colonists didn't understand germ theory. They didn't know that disease was caused by microscopic organisms spread through waste. Various theories about disease causation: miasmas, bad air, humoral imbalance, divine punishment. But they didn't understand the actual mechanism, so they didn't practice the sanitation measures that would have actually helped. Here's the quirky detail: despite the filth and the disease, colonists survived and even thrived in many cases. This wasn't because they were healthier than modern people. It was because those who survived to adulthood had built up immune systems through constant exposure to pathogens. Childhood was deadly. High mortality rates meant that many children died from preventable diseases. But those who survived childhood had immune systems that could handle the pathogenic load of colonial life. Streets in colonial towns were basically open sewers. If it rained, water would flow through town carrying waste from outhouses, animal pens, and households. People waded through this water. Animals walked through it. Food carts rolled through it. The water supply was often contaminated because wells were dug near outhouses and waste accumulated around them. Water was something you boiled or turned into beer because drinking it unprocessed was risky. Your own household contributes to this filth. You use a chamber pot that gets emptied into a pit or outside. You wash in water that's then thrown out. You prepare food and throw scraps outside or to animals. You and everyone else in your household produces human waste that goes into outhouses or pits. The smell in your house, particularly in the bedroom where multiple people sleep, is probably considerable. A mixture of human body odor, urine, and general filth that you become so accustomed to that you barely notice it anymore. Historians still argue about how people coped psychologically with living in such filthy conditions. Did they not notice? Did they accept it as inevitable? Did they develop some kind of psychological mechanism for tolerating the smell and filth? The evidence suggests colonists were aware of filth and tried to manage it. They cleaned. They used perfumes and herbs to mask smells. They complained about filth in letters and documents, but they also accepted it as simply part of life, unavoidable and unchangeable. Bathing in this context becomes even more complicated. When you bathe, you're getting temporarily cleaner, but you're bathing in water that's probably contaminated. You're bathing in a household surrounded by filth. So the bath provides psychological cleanliness more than actual cleanliness. You feel cleaner, but you're probably not meaningfully cleaner in terms of disease risk. By the time you're finally ready to sleep, you're surrounded by smell. The house smells like smoke, food, human bodies, animal presence, and waste. Your clothes smell like all of this. Your hair smells like it. Everything about your physical existence is permeated with the smell of colonial life. You don't consciously notice it anymore because you've adapted to it. It's just the smell of being alive in colonial America. As you lie in the darkness, your mind drifts toward financial concerns, or rather, toward the constant, gnawing anxiety about money that shapes colonial life for most people. The reality is that most colonists are perpetually poor. Even relatively successful farmers and craftspeople live with financial uncertainty. And the poor, the majority, live in constant anxiety about whether they'll have enough to eat, whether they'll be able to pay their debts, and whether they'll survive the year financially. The mainstream historical fact is this: colonial economies operated on a mixture of cash, credit, and barter. Cash was scarce. There wasn't enough coined money in circulation to conduct all business through cash transactions. So most transactions happen through credit or barter. A farmer might trade vegetables for cloth. A craftsperson might trade labor for goods. A merchant might extend credit to a customer, creating a debt that would be settled later, sometimes much later, sometimes never. This system created chronic debt. Many colonists owed money to merchants, to wealthier neighbors, or to landlords. Debts could persist for years. Sometimes debts were forgiven or forgotten. Sometimes they were collected ruthlessly. The threat of debt collection was constant. If you couldn't pay what you owed, you could lose property, be imprisoned, or be forced into indentured servitude to work off the debt. Here's the quirky detail: colonial account books reveal incredibly complex webs of mutual debt and credit. A merchant might owe money to a supplier, while a customer owes money to the merchant, while the customer is also owed money by someone else. People kept meticulous records of debts, but these records could be disputed or ambiguous. Debts were a form of relationship, economic connections that bound people together sometimes for their entire lives. If you're poor, your economic reality is particularly precarious. You might own no land. You might be renting from a wealthier person. Your income is irregular. You work for wages when you can find work, but work isn't constant. You might work seasonally, earning good money during harvest season and then having nothing during winter. You might have irregular trades or day labor. You're always looking for the next opportunity to earn money or credit. Wealth in colonial America was measured primarily in land. If you owned land, you had security and status. If you didn't own land, you were dependent on someone who did. Land ownership determined whether you had a vote in community decisions, whether you had status, whether you could pass property to your children. Land was wealth, and most colonists didn't have any. Taxes existed and were another source of financial anxiety. You had to pay taxes to support the colonial government and church. If you couldn't pay, you could be fined, imprisoned, or have property seized. Wealthy people paid more in absolute terms, but poor people's taxes represented a larger percentage of their total wealth and income. Historians still argue about poverty rates in colonial America and how much economic inequality existed. Some scholars argue that the colonies offered more opportunity for economic advancement than England did, particularly for white men. Others argue that colonial society was remarkably stratified and that economic mobility was limited. The evidence suggests that while some people did advance economically, the baseline poverty rate was high and economic inequality was significant. Merchants and wealthier craftspeople accumulated wealth partly through their labor and skill, but also through credit relationships with poor people and through trade networks. A successful merchant could become quite wealthy. A successful farmer could accumulate land and become a significant landowner. But these successes were built partly on the financial dependence of poor colonists. If you're thinking about money as you drift towards sleep, you're probably thinking about specific debts or income needs. Do you owe money to someone? When will your next payment come? What will you do if the harvest fails and you can't meet your obligations? These questions keep many colonists awake at night. Financial anxiety is chronic and pervasive. By the time sleep finally comes, you've probably spent some mental energy worrying about money. You'll worry about it again tomorrow. The precariousness of colonial finances, the scarcity of cash, the reliance on credit, the constant threat of debt and loss, shapes daily anxiety and decision-making for most colonists. You're not thinking about wealth accumulation or investment. You're thinking about basic survival and whether you'll be able to meet your obligations. Just as you're about to fully surrender to sleep, you're jolted by a memory of something you witnessed last week: a public punishment. Someone was whipped in the town square for theft. Someone else was put in the stocks for breaking the Sabbath. These punishments are public, they're brutal, and they're absolutely central to how colonial justice works. The mainstream historical fact is this: colonial justice systems were swift, harsh, and public. Crimes were punished quickly, often with physical brutality. Branding was common. Mutilation was sometimes used. Public humiliation through stocks, pillories, and forced confession was standard. Execution happened for serious crimes: murder, rape, witchcraft, theft in some cases. Justice wasn't about rehabilitation or incarceration. It was about swift punishment, deterrence through example, and community participation in enforcement. The crime you witnessed wasn't a secret event. It was public theater. The community gathered to watch. The punishment was meant to be visible and memorable. The criminal's body bore the marks of justice: scars, missing ears, branded letters. That marked them as criminal for the rest of their life. Watching the punishment was part of being part of the community. Children attended, neighbors watched. The lesson was clear: break the rules and suffer publicly. Here's the quirky detail that reveals how embedded punishment was in colonial culture. Colonial people seemed to enjoy watching punishments. Crowds gathered. People brought their families. There was an element of entertainment to it. Though framed as moral instruction, the spectacle of punishment was one of the few forms of public entertainment available, and people engaged with it actively and enthusiastically. Colonial law was unequal in application. Wealthy people rarely received the same punishments as poor people for similar crimes. A wealthy man might be fined for breaking the Sabbath, while a poor man would be whipped. Social status shaped legal outcomes. Race also mattered. Punishments for enslaved people or free black people were often harsher than for white people. Justice wasn't blind. It was shaped by social hierarchy. If you committed a crime, the trial would be quick and the punishment would be public and severe. You might be able to claim benefit of clergy. If you could read a specific passage from the Bible, you might receive a lighter sentence. This created an incentive for people to learn to read that passage specifically, which is one of the quirks of colonial law. Imprisonment as a punishment was relatively rare in colonial America. People were held in jail to await trial, but jail wasn't typically used as a sentence. Instead, punishment was physical and public. Banishment, expulsion from the community, was another common punishment for serious crimes. If you were banished, you had to leave and never return. Breaking banishment could result in death. Historians still argue about how effective colonial justice systems actually were at deterring crime and maintaining order. Did the harsh public punishments actually prevent crime, or did crime continue regardless? The evidence suggests that crime persisted even with harsh punishments, which suggests that deterrence through fear was only partly effective. But harsh punishment also served other functions. It enforced social norms. It demonstrated community authority, it reinforced hierarchy, and it provided Catholic release for community tensions. Witchcraft trials happened in colonial America, particularly in Puritan communities. People were accused of being witches, of having supernatural powers to harm others. Trials could result in execution. The most famous trials were in Salem, Massachusetts in 1692, but witchcraft accusations happened throughout the colonies. These trials reveal the terrifying vulnerability of colonial people to accusation and the willingness of communities to execute people based on questionable evidence and supernatural belief. As you drift toward sleep, you're remembering the sounds of the whipping you witnessed, the crack of the whip, the screams of the victim, the murmurs of the crowd. You're remembering the marks on the victim's body afterward. You're hoping you never commit a crime serious enough to face public punishment. You're grateful that you're not in the stocks right now, humiliated and vulnerable. And you're understanding, at a bone-deep level, that the justice system exists to enforce obedience and hierarchy through fear and pain. But as winter deepens and you endure the cold and scarcity, are moments when the relentless work rhythm breaks. Holidays and seasonal gatherings provide brief respites from the ordinary grind. Christmas, if you're in a community that celebrates it, might bring a day or two of reduced work and maybe some special food. Harvest festivals in fall mark the end of the most intense work season. Militia musters, gatherings where all able-bodied men practice military readiness, happen periodically and function as social events alongside their military purpose. The mainstream historical fact is these colonial holidays varied by region and religion. Puritan communities in New England celebrated fewer holidays than Anglican or Catholic communities. Christmas was actually not a major celebration in Puritan areas. Some Puritans didn't celebrate at all, viewing it as too worldly or too connected to Catholic tradition. But harvest festivals, militia musters, election day celebrations, and other community gatherings provided breaks in the work routine and opportunities for celebration. Harvest festivals were significant occasions. After months of intense agricultural labor, the harvest represented survival for another year. Festivals involved feasting, eating preserved meats, fresh vegetables, maybe special foods. There was socializing, drinking, and sometimes dancing. The festival celebrated community, survival, and gratitude for the harvest. It was one of the few times when most colonists could eat relatively abundantly. Here's the quirky detail: some colonial holidays had strange or violent traditions. Faughts Day, Guy November Fee, was celebrated in some colonies with effigies burned and sometimes with aggressive pranks or violence against unpopular community members. These celebrations could serve as outlets for community tensions and aggression, directed at designated targets or figures. Militia musters served military purposes. Colonists practiced fighting, maintained readiness for defense, and prepared for potential conflicts with Native Americans or other enemies. But they also served social purposes. Men gathered, they socialized, they drank, they competed in demonstrations of strength or skill. Militia musters could last a full day or more, and included breaks for eating and socializing alongside the military exercises. Weddings were occasions for community celebration. A wedding brought the community together for a feast, celebration, and witness to a significant life event. Wedding celebrations could last multiple days, involving multiple meals and significant expenditure. For most colonists, a wedding was a rare opportunity to participate in a major celebration and feast. If you're thinking about upcoming celebrations as you drift towards sleep, leaves outside, you might be anticipating a gathering or holiday. You might be planning what you'll wear, what you'll bring to contribute to the celebration, who you'll see. These celebrations provide something precious: a break from routine, an opportunity to socialize beyond your immediate household, and a chance to experience abundance and joy. Historians still argue about how much these celebrations actually provided relief from the hardship of colonial life, or whether they were relatively minor breaks in an otherwise relentless grind. The evidence suggests that they mattered. People looked forward to them, they participated enthusiastically, and they served important social functions. But they were also brief. After a day or two of celebration, the work began again. As winter settles in, there might be a Christmas celebration coming. Leaves outside if your community marks it. There will definitely be a harvest festival next fall. There will be militia musters. Will be church gatherings that serve social as well as religious functions. These occasions punctuate the year and give you something to anticipate and remember. But for now, in the depths of winter, celebrations are memories of the past or distant hopes for the future. The present is cold, dark, and demanding. The immediate future is more cold and more work. The celebrations, when they come, will provide brief moments of break and connection. Until then, you endure. The darkness has deepened completely now. The fire in the hearth is dying down to embers. Someone has banked it carefully so it will last through the night without needing to be rebuilt in the morning. The house is cooling as the evening progresses. You're burrowed under blankets with other people. Family members, maybe a servant or apprentice, their warmth mingling with yours. The cough from your sibling has quieted. The household is settling into sleep. As your eyes close and consciousness begins to drift, the urgency of the day finally releases its grip. The spinning wheel is silent. Animals are bedded down. The fire is banked. The work will resume tomorrow, but for now there's only rest. The rhythm of colonial life. The relentless cycle of labor, survival, and endurance pauses briefly in sleep. The sensory world softens as you slip toward unconsciousness. The smell of the house, smoke, human bodies, animal presence, the accumulated filth of winter, fades into background awareness. The cold recedes slightly as your body temperature stabilizes under blankets. The sounds of the household, the creak of old wood, the murmur of someone shifting position, the distant sound of wind outside, become almost musical in their familiarity. Your mind drifts through the day's events. You remember the cough. You remember the church service and the minister's stern warnings. You remember market day gossip about events in distant places. You remember the spinning wheel and the calusas on your fingers. You remember the meal, thin pottage and hard bread, but it filled your belly. You remember the music in the evening and the brief moment of joy it brought. You remember the work that consumed most of the day, the endless cycle of tasks that will resume tomorrow. The weight of colonial life, the constant work, the threat of disease, the precarious finances, the rigid social hierarchy, the unfreedom that surrounds you in different forms for different people. All of this fade from conscious awareness as sleep approaches. Your body is exhausted enough that it will likely sleep deeply, dreamlessly, until morning comes again and the cycle resumes. Sighed. There's a kind of peace and surrender to exhaustion. You're not thinking about problems that can't be solved tonight. You're not planning tomorrow because tomorrow will bring its own demands. You're simply allowing your body to rest because rest is necessary for survival. Sleep is both escape and necessity, a break from the demands of colonial life and also the biological requirement that makes continued survival possible. The last thing you notice before sleep fully claims you is the warmth of the bodies around you. In the cold of a colonial winter, human warmth is precious. The people sleeping nearby, their body heat, their breathing, their simple presence, creates a cocoon of warmth that makes sleep possible. You're thinking about how much worse the night would be without this companionship, how much harder the cold would be to bear alone. And then sleep comes. The consciousness that has been aware of work and worry and the endless demands of survival retreats. Your breathing slows. Your body relaxes completely into the mattress. The last of the day's tension drains away. For the next several hours, you're not a colonial person struggling to survive. You're simply sleeping, your body and mind finding the restoration they desperately need. The house settles around you. The fire burns low in the hearth. The animals are quiet in their pens and shelters. The wind blows outside, cold and unforgiving. But inside, in the darkness, you sleep. Tomorrow the work will begin again. The same work as today, the same work as yesterday, the same work that will continue until spring and then shift into different but equally demanding labor. But tonight, there is only rest. Breathing becomes rhythmic and deep. Your dreams, if they come, are private mysteries. The colonial world continues its endless cycle around you while you sleep, and for a few hours at least, you are freed from its demands.